This video is sponsored by SimpliSafe. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. The Trump administration wants more things to be made in the USA, and that includes lumber. Now, we have vast lumber resources in this country, and yet we're still importing about 30% of the lumber that we use, including about 15% from Canada. So here's the question. Couldn't we just produce all of our own lumber here? Do we even need lumber from Canada or any other country for that matter? Well, the answer is a bit more complicated than a simple yes or no. And there's a lot going on right now, from tariffs to presidential orders to other things that are going to impact the industry. So let's talk about it. The timber industry is a boom and bust business, and a lot of the health of the industry depends upon how much demand there is, and specifically demand from construction. In fact, in the US, over 65% of lumber is used in construction, including residential remodeling and new home construction. As I mentioned, here in the US, we import about 30% of our lumber from various countries, including Brazil, Sweden, and New Zealand. In fact, recently at my Home Depot here in Texas, I came across lumber made in both Sweden and New Zealand, which is kind of crazy to me considering that we have a very large lumber industry here in the US and vast forests. At the end of the day, though, it's all about cost. And if those other countries can produce lumber for cheaper, then the Home Depots of the world are going to buy that lumber and then sell it to the rest of us. Canada also has vast lumber resources and has a huge lumber industry, although it has shrunk in recent years. And 15% of all the lumber we use in the US comes from Canada. But as I mentioned before, the Trump administration wants to expand the US lumber industry to cover 100% of our lumber consumption. In fact, on March 1st of this year, President Trump signed an executive order titled Immediate Expansion of American Timber Production. Now, there is a lot in this order, including streamlined permitting, which means that they are going to remove policies or regulations that, in their words, put an undue burden on timber production. The order also mentions the Endangered Species Act and directs the Secretary of the Interior to use provisions which allow federal agencies to respond quickly to emergencies. Essentially, the idea is that they plan to overhaul the Endangered Species Act and narrow its focus. The Endangered Species Act has been used since the 1990s to restrict logging in areas where there are endangered species, such as the spotted owl or the marbled murrelet. Under Trump's orders, those areas will likely be opened up to logging. Now, to be clear, there's a lot of emotion and concern over some of these provisions. In fact, there was an image floating around social media saying that Trump had ordered an area 3 times the size of California to be chopped down. That's not true. What is true, though, is that Trump plans to significantly expand the areas open to logging, and that will likely include areas that have historically been protected, areas that have been reserved for old growth forests, and areas that have been designated as protected because of endangered species. And while that may sound bad, what we need to understand is that we have not done a good job of managing those forests. We've tried to protect those areas, but the very act of protecting them from logging has actually placed them in severe danger of fire. Fuels have built up on the forest floor, which makes fires more intense and harder to control when they do happen. And without managing those forests through things like controlled burns and also logging, we put ourselves at greater risk of more severe fires. As an example, loggers build paths and roads in remote areas, and without those logging roads, it becomes much more difficult to get wildland firefighters to where they need to be. Loggers can also assist with building fire breaks that will help contain or slow major fires. We've also been very aggressive in fighting any small fires that pop up in those areas, even naturally occurring fires, to the point where when the winds pick up and the conditions are dry and a fire does whip through that we can't control, the losses become significant. Then all of it burns and no one's happy. So should we protect our forests and our endangered species? Yes, absolutely. But we also need to look at policies which are not working and see what can be changed so that we can both protect our forests and better manage our forests while also allowing for logging activity, which can help the health of the forests. It can also improve communities and economies and allow us to take advantage of quality lumber, which would otherwise just burn and be wasted. If it's done right, we can turn the tide and increase the overall health of our forests and support businesses. In fact, I recently sat down with Nick Smith, who is the Public Affairs Director for the American Forest Resource Council. And here's what he had to say.
I think we need to be looking at what's happening now in the fact that we're in the midst of a wildfire and smoke crisis. And it's hard to talk about Northwest fiber supply without talking about the 2020 Labor Day fires in Oregon, which caused generational losses across forests, across all ownerships. The northern spotted owl in the Labor Day fires lost over 500 square miles of roosting and foraging habitat. And the research that has come out over the past 20 years has found that, like old growth, the greatest threat to the northern spotted owl in their habitat is severe wildfire. Of course, we've seen over the past 30 years that taking loggers out of the forest is not going to recover, the species. The promise of the incoming administration is that I think they're willing to look at things differently from a land management perspective, to say our environmental laws and policies are 30, 40, in some cases 50 years old. And are they meeting the challenges of today, whether it's climate change, severe wildfire, insects, and disease that are heavily impacting our forests? The policies of decades ago aren't working. If we're going to meet today's challenges, we need to be doing more of that active stewardship, more of that active forest management. And of course, as an industry, we purchase federal timber sales. We do restoration work on federal lands. We provide the boots on the ground that enables the Forest Service to achieve its conservation objectives. And so, by taking another look at these arbitrary policies, we could be doing more management, and that obviously has a beneficial impact to, our industry and our ability to make quality wood.
So the policies which currently exist are outdated and need to be updated for today's realities. And there's a lot that the lumber industry can do to help the government and the Forest Service in accomplishing conservation goals if it's done right. Now, some people are afraid, and with good reason based on history, that it may not be done right. But here's the truth. The lumber industry has changed a lot over the decades and today operates more sustainably than ever before. If we work together, we are far more likely to come up with plans that will preserve forests for endangered species habitat, preserve forests for recreation and future generations, and also allow logging. And again, if it's done right, we'll see far fewer forests go up in smoke, wasting quality lumber and releasing massive amounts of pollution into the air. So on one side, the Trump administration is planning on removing regulatory obstacles to increase the amount of domestic logging, but there's far more to the story than just that. But before we get into the rest, I want to talk about this video's sponsor, SimpliSafe. Now, I do all of my videos here in my garage, but I get comments from people who sometimes think that this is a Home Depot. It's not. This is my wood and it's valuable. And if you're like me and you want to take care of your precious things, whether it's your lumber or your tools or your kids, you need SimpliSafe. If you haven't heard of them, then you're really missing out. SimpliSafe offers comprehensive security for your whole home. They have everything that you need to keep it secure, from cameras to panic buttons to smart locks to water sensors and more. And the setup is really easy. I was able to do it myself. I just downloaded the app and followed the instructions. SimpliSafe has several different plans to choose from, including their monitoring plans, which start at only around $1 per day. And so you can customize and choose a plan that best fits your needs. Some of their plans include SimpliSafe Active Guard, which has monitoring agents that can react in real time to suspicious people approaching your home. They can see them and they can speak to them. They can trigger alarms and spotlights, or even request urgent police dispatch if it's necessary. That's something that old school systems just don't offer. Now, you can save 50% off your SimpliSafe security system when you sign up for a professional monitoring plan and get your first month free. Visit simplisafe.com/DIY-with-Dave to customize yours. If you don't love it, return it for a full refund within 60 days. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. So as I mentioned, the Trump administration is looking to expand logging in the US, and his stated goal is complete independence. So is that possible? Well, just as I said at the top of the video, we import around 30% of the lumber that we use in the US. And so in order to make up for that 30%, the Trump administration policies to open up more logging would make a difference in supply, but not right away. Also, there's not currently enough lumber mill capacity to mill all the lumber that we need, even if we were able to cut it. The reason for that is that a large number of mills have closed in the past few years. for two main reasons. The first being rising costs. Like most other areas of the economy, the lumber industry has experienced huge cost increases. Things like labor and insurance and energy all cost more. The second reason is a decrease in demand. Home building has stagnated and people are not doing as many remodels as they did during the boom times of the pandemic. So if a mill has fewer sales and increased costs, it's only a matter of time before they close. In tough times like these, lumber companies really only have a couple of options. First, they could invest in their mills and make them more efficient, which would save costs in the long run. But of course, that requires an initial cash outlay, which may be difficult for some. Another option is that mills could curtail their operations or produce less or fewer products to become more efficient. While this may reduce their costs and stop the bleeding, it's only really a temporary fix until things get better because they're still making less money overall. The next option is that they can close down completely, and we've seen a lot of mills do that. In some cases, the mill shutdowns are temporary and they could be brought back on board if demand picks up again. But in other cases, they're completely shuttered and they're not coming back. Now, all of this is to say that with all of the mill closures and curtailments that we've seen in the past few years, we do not currently have the capacity to produce 100% of all of the lumber that we need and that we use. At least not until shuttered mills are reopened or new mills are built. But we could get there, it just won't happen overnight. It should also be mentioned here that lumber mills do not make decisions about spending millions to build new mills, retool old mills, or bring closed mills on board unless they have some certainty about where the market is headed. Without that, there's too much risk and nothing will change, and we will remain dependent on foreign sources of lumber forever. And that brings me to my next point. As I mentioned in the first part of the video, the lumber industry is a boom and bust business. It went bust in the early 90s and then went boom in the early 2000s. It went bust again in 2008 when the housing crisis hit, and then went boom again during COVID. And we're currently on a downswing right now, and lumber companies are watching the market very closely to see what will happen next. So let's talk about what may happen next. But before we get into a lot of those details, I really want to understand what you were thinking. How do you feel about the Trump administration's goal to increase logging? Do you think it's a good idea? Is it worth the price? Do you think that more logging in our forests will make them healthier, or do you think that it's going to further damage them? Please leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts, especially if you have some specific insight from perhaps being close to the industry in some way, whether you live in the area where they do logging or you've actually worked in the industry. I love reading your comments and I love learning from what you have to say, so please leave a comment. All right, so to understand what happens next, there are a few facts that we need to establish. First is that there is currently a shortage of affordable homes in this country, driven mainly by high home prices and high interest rates, and yes, high prices for construction inputs like lumber and concrete and sheetrock. For the time being, it doesn't appear that interest rates will change significantly, and housing prices for the most part have remained steady. So what that means is that there is a potential for a lot of homes to be built and the potential for a huge demand for lumber. But unless the economy improves, that's unlikely to materialize anytime soon. In fact, we've been talking about this pent-up demand and shortage in housing for years now, and honestly, little has changed. The second fact to understand is that our lumber production is not just about imports. We also export a lot of lumber. In fact, we export about 13% of all of the lumber that we produce. And our largest export partners are Canada, Mexico, and China. With all of the tariffs and threats that are being made against our trading partners, we risk damaging some of these relationships, and as a result, they may be more inclined to trade with other partners like Canada. That will leave the door open for Canada to come in and take market share from US companies. Now, if our goal is to produce all of the lumber that we use domestically, then maybe that's fine. But what we need to understand is that the lumber that we export is not always the same as the lumber that we use internally. For example, we export tons of red oak hardwood to China. They love the stuff. But there's not a lot of demand for red oak in the US. And so we essentially take a product to people who want it and are willing to pay higher prices for it. That's kind of the essence of trade, isn't it? We create a good and have a surplus that we don't want, but these guys over here do want it. And so we sell it to them for a higher price, and they're happy because they get what they want. And we're happy because we got paid for our product. Everyone comes out ahead in that transaction. Another great example of positive trade like that is chicken feet. Now, stick with me for just a second on this because it's not about lumber specifically, but it illustrates the point. We don't really eat chicken feet here in the US, but they do in China. It's considered a delicacy. And with what's currently going on with tariffs between the US and China, China's no longer taking our chicken feet. So what is going to happen to all the leftover chicken feet? Well, nothing really. Maybe they might be ground down to be used as fertilizer or something like that, but those products don't bring in as much cash as we could bring in by selling the chicken feet, our unwanted chicken feet, to China. So in this case, our chicken farmers are not getting paid as much, and all the folks in China who want their chicken feet are not getting them. In that case, no one is happy. What is happening right now is that we are erecting barriers to trade where there previously weren't any. And another unfortunate example of that is our current actions toward Canada. Now, we've levied tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber going back all the way to Ronald Reagan. So lumber tariffs aren't anything new, and it's something that we've been dealing with for a long time. And tariffs really are a tool. They're a tool that's meant to be used sparingly. In the case of Canada, the current lumber tariff rate is around 14%, which was raised to that level by President Biden from 8% just before he left office. More recently, the Commerce Department has announced that the tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber would be raised to around 35% later this year. But they didn't give an exact date as to when that would happen. But that's significant. That's pretty high. And all of this is on the backdrop of all of the other tariffs that Trump's been talking about. And to be clear, the 35% tariffs on imports of Canadian softwood lumber is not about fentanyl. And they're not reciprocal tariffs, but they're called anti-subsidy and anti-dumping tariffs. The allegation is that the Canadian government is engaging in unfair trade practices by subsidizing Canadian lumber production and dumping their excess lumber capacity into the US market, which depresses prices and impacts the ability for US lumber manufacturers to compete. Now, whether or not you believe the allegation or believe that tariffs are the best tool to deal with it has a lot to do with which side of the border you're on and what industry you're a part of. Organizations like the National Lumber Building Materials Association and the National Association of Home Builders want free trade in order to keep prices low and benefit their industries. But organizations like the U.S. Lumber Coalition believe that tariffs should go even higher. In fact, the executive director of the U.S. Lumber Coalition recently said this: "The American lumber industry and forestry sector today has the capacity to supply nearly all U.S. lumber demand. And with continued strong trade law enforcement and additional tariff measures being contemplated by President Trump, the U.S. industry can, over time, supply 100% of the softwood lumber need of the United States. That means more made in the USA softwood lumber is being produced by U.S. companies and workers to supply our domestic housing needs." The underlying truth about tariffs, though, is that they increase prices. That's what they're designed to do. The price of the foreign good is increased so that domestic firms who can't produce as cheaply as the importers can compete. Now, there's also an argument for economies of scale, which basically means that once the initial investment is made and once mills are able to get some sort of critical mass, then they're going to be able to produce more cheaply and the prices will come down. But that rarely happens, and when it does, it takes a long time. Another thing to understand here is that the lumber industry in the US has been going through some major shifts over the past few decades. In the past, the Pacific Northwest was the lumber powerhouse, but that's been shifted to the Southwest. And a lot of large lumber companies have been buying up smaller mill companies or opening up new mills themselves. Also, just as a side note, a lot of the companies operating in the southeastern US are actually Canadian companies. And they're investing south of the border to get around US tariffs on Canadian lumber. So they not only benefit from the tariffs, but they also benefit from any other lumber policies that make US lumber more expensive. Now, here's the thing about the lumber industry in the South. Nearly all of the land that's used for harvesting logs in the South is private. And Trump's executive orders around logging really have almost no impact there. That impact will really be felt in the Pacific Northwest, where the logging industry has been declining for decades. The lumber industry in the South does, however, benefit again from tariffs, as their products will look more attractive by comparison to imported lumber, and they'll be able to raise their prices. All right, so let's answer the main question for this video and provide some important context that will help us better understand what is likely to happen next. So can we produce all of the lumber that we need domestically? The short answer is yes. We are planning on logging more of our forests, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, to increase the supply of raw logs. And if we build out more mill capacity, then we should be able to produce everything that we need. But it will cost more and it will take some time for that to happen. And that is really the ultimate point here. There are going to be trade-offs. Under this plan, lumber will cost more, especially in the beginning. As I mentioned before, we may be able to gain some efficiencies on volume, which could lead to lower prices eventually, but that's going to take time. Also, we're at risk of alienating our current trade partners and losing out on the export market. Market share is going to be eaten up by Canadian lumber, and it will be difficult to get those customers back. And it's like shooting ourselves in the foot. Also, if we don't manage our forests well, then we would be at risk for losing our forest to both logging and to fires, which would be a travesty for all of us, for the environment and for future generations. The biggest problem that I see is our resilience. And what I mean by that is our ability to withstand shocks to supply and shocks to demand. If housing picks up, like we know that it has to at some point in the future to meet that demand, lumber demand will skyrocket and our current capacity just is not sufficient to pick up the slack. And if we isolate ourselves and we don't have ready access to foreign markets, then prices will skyrocket. Or if there's a downturn here and we can't sell our lumber to other markets, other foreign markets as easily because of our trade practices, then it'll hurt our domestic industry. And that could cause more mills to close as well, which would make us worse off in the long run. At the end of the day, I'm in favor of more free trade. Yes, we will need to manage our forests better, and yes, we need a robust domestic lumber industry for strategic purposes, but trade is an activity that, for the most part, gives everyone what they want. We mess with that at our own peril. Now, with that said, there have definitely been some devastating impacts from past policies that have decimated rural areas of our country, and we need to do more to lessen those negative impacts and soften the blow for areas that may be hit hard by those cyclical markets. No one knows exactly what is going to happen and when. Only time will tell. But one thing is for sure, and that is that I'll be watching the lumber markets for the latest developments and bringing you my insights. So if you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and check out my other videos. Please also be sure to leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts. What are you seeing where you live? What kind of insights do you have to add to the conversation? I love reading your comments, so please leave a comment. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.